All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending today. My name is Luke Baumgartner. I'm a research fellow here at the program on extremism at George Washington University, and I'm joined today by Dr. Craig Johnson. We are here today to talk about his newest book, How to Talk to Your Son About Fascism. I'll hold up my personal copy right here. So today, Dr. Johnson has graciously agreed to join us to talk about his new book. And sometimes my introductions don't often do the guest justice, so I will let Craig introduce himself and kind of expound upon his own work. So, Craig, take it away.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Luke. And thanks to everybody at GW and the program on extremism for having me here. I really appreciate it. Yeah, this book grew out of a combination of academic and personal interest for me. The idea of the book, the hope about it was to sort of bridge the gap between academic inquiry about the extreme right wing and the dangers that it poses to Western society generally, and also, yeah, my personal academic work, which is primarily about Latin America and Latin American dictatorships in the 60s and 70s and sort of the growth of those things. But the thing is that when you're talking at at a faculty function, or you're at a party, or you're meeting friends and you tell them that you study fascism, usually they end up saying like, well, what are we supposed to do about this? And I decided that I wanted to write a book about that. So that's why I wrote this one.
Yeah, I often find myself in a similar situation when people ask what I do for a living.
Yes, yeah,
It's
yes.
some fun workarounds there. Um, Yeah, so you started out by saying that your academic background is in Latin American history, which is a field of study that I think most lay observers might not connect to your work studying fascism. So how did you get to studying right-wing politics in Latin America?
Yeah, so when I first started out in higher ed, which is all the way back in 2014, I came in because I wanted to study the right wing, because I was curious about it, essentially because I didn't understand it, which is, I think, anytime I've talked to a student, an undergrad who's like, I'm thinking about graduate school, usually the advice is like, find something that you think you'll be curious about in 20 years. And It was something that I didn't understand and I wanted to. And back in 2014, the time and place in the world that had been most recently very successful for the right wing was in South America. And I started out essentially because of a curiosity about that. And that continues to be the abiding curiosity in my academic work, is how and why could right-wing movements have been so successful in all of these countries essentially simultaneously, in historical time, right? We're talking about 20 years during which right-wing military governments were in charge in a lot of South American states. And these governments were not themselves fascist per se, but there were fascist elements within their movement. There were fascist supporters within their movements, and a curiosity and a fascination with these smaller groups and how they become bigger is one of the reasons that I ended up writing this book. It's a book about recruitment and growth. It's a book about propaganda and how it harnesses young people, specifically young men. And it's ultimately a practical book, a guide for people for how to navigate these challenges and how to keep young men safer.
So I think, every other month or every month or so, it feels like there's a new book that comes out about fascism or right-wing extremism in general. Um, so you touched briefly a bit on, your motivation to write the book. So how do you think yours differs mostly outside of a practical guide? What makes it different? What makes it stand out from, the plethora of others that we see?
Yeah, I mean, yes, you're right. There's quite a few of these books out, and we're probably not going to see that stop, at least anytime soon. Um, One of the main things that differentiates this book from a lot of the others is, well, when it comes to academic books, this is a book that sort of like straddles that line. When I was pitching the book to the editors at Routledge, I said that I wanted it to be New York Times readable.
Hmm.
That was the goal that I was striving for. So it doesn't use a massive amount of academic jargon or academic language. And that was intentional. That was me trying to make sure that an educated but lay audience could read the book. The other thing is that it's not about fascism as a whole. It's not about fascism in society. It's specifically about a particular vulnerable population, young people. Essentially, the central premise of the book, the central promise of the book, is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure when it comes to fascism. We are already where we are now. And so, in a sense, our task now, if we are trying to reduce the appeal and spread of fascism, which I think is probably a goal of most of the people in this room, then that means hurting their recruitment chances. It means making it harder for them to recruit people. And the way that you do that is you reduce the number of people who want to join their movements. And how do you do that? Well, you have to get at them before they can get recruited. And that's what this book is about.
So it's mostly prevention as opposed to exiting, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, in conversation with some of the experts that I contacted when I was writing this book, some of whom are people who worked in. I mean, I'm glad that you mentioned like Exit. Like Exit UK or Exit Germany or what used to be called Exit US, and they're not called that anymore. A lot of these groups are run by formers, right? People
Hmm.
who have been in extremist organizations and are engaging with kids in a sort of like scared straight capacity. I probably don't have to tell everybody here, but like there are some serious challenges with programs like that, in the same sense that there are serious challenges with the more crime-oriented scared straight systems, which is that ultimately what's happening is that you're putting young people in a room with people who have been Nazis, right? And like
Hmm.
that carries some challenges. And there are known instances in which people pose as people who have left the movement when in fact they haven't, or are sort of like soft on ramp into movement building. And so one of the things that I try to drill home in the book is that getting somebody out of this ideology is much harder than keeping them out of than like preventing them from entering in the first place, right?
Hmm.
And so ultimately, it's a book about inoculation, right? It's a book about getting out ahead of this, helping parents and educators know what the threats are so that they can try to avoid their kids succumbing to them.
Yeah. So let's address the elephant in the room, the F word, fascism. Um, you give a very concise and clear definition at the beginning, I think in chapter one. Um, so for the audience, how do you define fascism? And um, did you draw any inspiration from other, scholars on the work, like Roger Griffin, Robert Paxton, Jason Stanley, any of those sorts of folks?
Yeah, you named the people that I was going to say. Yes, Paxton and Griffin are my primary points of reference when it comes to defining fascism. Again, yeah, I'm sure that most people in this room know that this is a slippery question. It's a tough one. And in an academic sense, like in an academic world, I am absolutely on board with wrangling with it and trying to figure it out. But I also wanted to be writing this book for people who like knowing the ins and outs and like having arguments about like fascist minimum versus like a laundry list of what fascism is versus like panegyric nationalism. Like I'm not going to put the words panegyric nationalism in a book that I think that like everyday people should read.
Yeah.
So instead, I wanted a sort of rough and ready definition, and that was I primarily did that, or I tried to, by defining fascism in relation to the rest of the right wing, and
Hmm.
talking about what makes fascism different from more mainstream conservatives. And I've homed in on just a couple examples here. So like fascism and conservatism, they might say similar things, they might talk about some similar things, but there are some key differences, right? The primary ones in my mind, and these are the ones that I talk to people about, are that unlike conservatives, fascists are revolutionaries, right? Mitt Romney is not a revolutionary. George W. Bush is not a revolutionary. They want essentially to maintain something like the status quo. Fascists might say that that's what they want, but when you talk to them about how they actually want things to work, they're talking about, in many cases, like a total transformation of like social, economic, geopolitical systems, right? They want to reorganize the world. That's something that very much differentiates them from most of the rest of the right wing. And the other big thing, and this is one of the things that I try to make sure that, or that I hope that people come away from the book with, especially if they are not an expert, is that fascism is violent. Unlike the majority of the rest of conservative movements, fascism doesn't just believe that violence might be useful. Like many political movements believe that violence can be useful,
Yes.
but fascists believe that violence is good, that it's good to be violent, like it's good for a young man to be violent, and that it's good for society for there to be violent people. And this is something that really differentiates fascism from most of the rest of the right wing, who believe that partisan violence might be something that is necessary, but not that it's something that is a good in itself, right? Whereas if you talk about people like Gavin McInnes, the founder of the Proud Boys, if you look at Patriot Front today, like they believe that violence is good. It's good for men to be violent. And I think that those are the two things that are really, really important when it comes to both experts and non-experts thinking about like, well, am I going to call this fascist or not? Does this really deserve the term? Do they want to radically transform government and society? And do they believe that violence is useful? That said, though, if you're talking about like if I'm giving advice to a parent who's worried about their kid's behavior, I'm not going to say like, oh, well, don't worry, your kid isn't a Nazi. He's just a Confederate nationalist, right? Like that's not a reassuring thing to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, in that context, I'm perfectly fine using it as a pejorative.
Yeah. You could put lipstick on a pig, still a pig.
That's right. I mean, literally, I think I do say this in the book. Like, if it quacks like a duck,
Yeah.
like it's perfectly fine to scream "duck" at it in the street, right? That's fine.
Yes. Yeah. One of our, I'm sure we have, a mutual acquaintance here in Jared Holt, who works over at ISD. He wrote an
Hmm.
article a couple months back, you know, talking about the duck test. If walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, then it's a duck.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that most scholars that I know of are pretty comfortable with saying that, yeah, that's where we are right now, and that like I don't mean this as an insult, but like the antiquarian like discussions about what is and isn't fascism, I think that that's extremely useful. I think it's
Hmm.
extremely useful in an academic setting. But if we're talking about public education, we're talking about public history, then we need to use different terms. We need to use the words that people know, and that's where I'm at.
Yeah, and I think you kind of bring up a really valid and prescient point, like, to be a little bit wonky here, when you sort of decided to focus on Latin America, and the fascist movements that sort of sprung up in the right-wing governments. I watched a lecture a couple weeks back, from this German historian who gave a lecture over at, I think it was Cambridge, and he talked about the need to denazify fascism and to sort of move it away from that and put it in a broader context.
Yes. Oh yeah. Absolutely. That is a drum I have been beating for a long, long time, and obviously not alone in that. There's many people who do that, and yeah, I think that that's important to do not just in the academy but also in the wider world.
Yes.
That's one of the hopes that I have, especially for a lay audience coming to the book, is that most of the time, when people think about fascism, they think about Nazis, and hey, no surprise, and no shame in that, right? But fascism is, in a word, normal. It is a normal political ideology, not in that it is acceptable, but in that it is everywhere all the time. And if we think about it as this historically bounded thing, I think we do a disservice not just to ourselves as scholars, but to the people who read our scholarship and the students we educate.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get to, sort of the meat and potatoes
Great.
of, you know, how how somebody would talk to their son or a young man in their life about fascism. So, let's start with a why first. And why is it that fascist movements prey on young men primarily to fill their ranks?
Yeah. What I like to say about this is that fascism appeals to young men and fascism appeals to young men. like in both senses of the word, right? Fascists intentionally go after young men because fascism needs young people to do dirty work, right? It needs people who are willing to risk their lives and their bodies and their minds. Young people, uniquely, do not have fully developed brains. This is something that we see from our colleagues in like cognitive science and neuroscience departments, right? Young people's brains are worse than older people's brains at evaluating long-term risk. And so they're more willing to put themselves at risk for things that they believe in. This is something that all political movements need and do, right? Like there's a reason that typically the people who are out there, locking arms in front of the police, they typically are younger people. This is because their ways of evaluating risk are different. They have fewer people depending on them, right? So that's one of the reasons. The other reason is that fascism appeals to young men in that it is appealing to them. And that has a couple reasons of its own. The first is that fascism, I think that this, if there are going to be some fascist minimums, I think that this is certainly one of them. Fascism is sexist. It is male supremacist. I have yet to hear about a fascist movement that is not. Whereas there have been fascist movements that are not particularly motivated or organized around race,
Yes.
at least not outwardly. But
Hmm.
almost all of them are motivated and organized around sex and gender. And so this means that fascism is a uniquely male-oriented political ideology, as compared to liberalism, conservatism, Christian democracy, communism, socialism. Like those might have prescribed gender roles within them, but they're not intended for a specifically male audience. So that's one of the things. The other reason, and this is partly the reason that fascist groups are particularly appealing to young men today, in the same way that they were in the 1920s and 30s in Central Europe, is that young men's lives, and particularly in the United States, we're talking about young cisgender heterosexual white men. But in different countries, that's different. That's different in South Asia. That's different in Greece. That's different in Japan, etc. In these places, whoever the majority group, the majority ethnic or socio-religious group, those groups are, and for good reason, and thank goodness, losing relative power in our society. And older folks, middle-aged people, even many young adults can look at that and say, like, good. It is good that other people are being empowered. But a young person, somebody who's 10, 18, even 25, might not feel the privileges that they have. Instead, they look at their life and they see themselves as being oppressed. They don't get to pick when they wake up. They don't get to pick where they go to school. They don't get to pick where they go. They might not even get to pick what they eat, right? They experience oppression. That's what it feels like to them. I'm sure that all of us recall this from when we were kids, right? Fascism, especially today, preys on this feeling and says, yes, you are a member of an oppressed group. And it is white cisgender heterosexual men. And it uses this sort of like cocktail of sort of like experienced oppression, both in terms of relative loss of privilege and in terms of the, arguably oppressive experiences that young people experience in their life. They're not in control of their lives. And it uses that in order to justify and bring young people into heinous politics.
Yeah, so young people don't get to choose, like you said, they don't get to choose a lot of the parts of their life. Like you said, as teenagers, you have to go to school, you have to do
Yes.
X, Y, and Z, you have to do your chores, and this fascist appeal to particular young men that you're talking about, it kind of acts as an escape hatch, I guess, for them.
Yeah, yeah. It is a way to feel power.
Hmm.
It's a movement that tells you you should have power. Society was better when people like you had power. And also, and most importantly, fascism tells young men that if they say these things, if they say an anti-Semitic joke, if they say the N-word, if they talk about like creepy instrumental dating strategy, it will tell them, and if you say this in public, people will yell at you. If you say this to your mom, she'll get mad. If you say this to your teacher, you'll get in trouble, which is true because those things are heinous and terrible, and you shouldn't be saying those things, right? And you can't just like say them openly in school, and parents should be like, hey, please don't say these things in our house, or like, I don't accept that, or I don't like it. And when that happens, there's a lot of fascist messaging on the internet, especially, that will say like, well, just try it and see what happens. See if you really are allowed to believe whatever you want, or if, in fact, there's stuff that you're supposed to believe. See if you really are allowed to make your own decisions, or if, in fact, it's circumscribed. And the kid will say the thing and get in trouble and be like, aha, it's true. There are things I'm not allowed to believe. These beliefs are oppressed. They are being suppressed. And that feeds into this victim narrative that they have, right? My beliefs, my ideas are being attacked. They are unacceptable. People are oppressing me because of what I think. And it creates this feedback loop.
Yeah. So, obviously this victim narrative doesn't come from, just out of thin air.
Hmm.
In chapter 3 is where you kind of talk about some of the most influential platforms and people, the influencers that have this sort of grip on a lot of young men right now. So who are some of those people, and what are some of those platforms that you think, parents, guardians, or anybody else with a young man in their life should be cognizant of?
Yeah, this was a real pitfall when I was writing the book,
Hmm.
because I started drafting this book 2 years ago, and so I knew that any just like laundry list of these people would be outdated as soon as it was published, which is a tough one, right? So, for example, I talk about 4chan pretty extensively in the book. 4chan has been hacked and might be, going away, right? And thank goodness 4chan is terrible,
Yeah.
but that probably just means that they're going to fragment and be harder to find now, and it's a little bit less useful for scholars of extremism. Probably the most important one is somebody that probably people know about already. His name is Andrew Tate, a rapist, human trafficker, and multiple financial swindler slash MMA artist influencer, who essentially advocates rape as a social solution for the supposed problem that young men are not having sex with the people that they want to have sex with. Another potentially less known example is a guy named Andrew Anglin.
Mm.
Anglin might be known to some scholars of extremism, but is not as known to most audiences. Anglin was the creator of the Daily Stormer, which or at least very recently was, the largest neo-Nazi website in the United States. The Daily Stormer was named after Der Stürmer, which was a daily newspaper in the Nazi Party. And Anglin is a really fascinating figure because he was in on the ground floor of all of this. Unlike a lot of the other types, he's a true believer. Like, he's just a straight up neo-Nazi. Like,
Hmm.
he would be like, I'm a fascist. He's like a neo-Nazi. And he saw the writing on the wall. He knew that there was a possibility for an extended expansion of right-wing power, not just in the United States and the world. And he knew that the way to do that was to get young people. And so he is on record all the way back in the 2010s saying, I'm going after the 10-year-olds. I want the 10-year-olds to see my propaganda. I want them to see my memes. I want them to laugh at my jokes. I want them to listen to my podcasts. I want them to read my paper. And this was brilliant. And it worked. The 10-year-olds that Anglin and people like him got in the 2010s, those people are Doge staffers now. I mean, like, it worked. And there's dozens of other people like him, all across the internet, various different forums. But the fact is that each individual one of them is not the most is not the really important thing here. Like each individual one of them makes up this bigger, wider movement. But I think Anglin is an important person to know about, partly because of his success, of his prescience. Right? He
Hmm.
very successfully organized something.
Yeah, I think, he's, sort of fallen in and out of the sort of far right limelight a couple of times here and there,
Yes.
especially in the last, couple of years since Twitter became X, and
Yep.
he's been banned and unbanned. Um, so just to touch on England just for like one more minute, um, do you think his, repeated on again, off again relationship um, with X, or his time in the limelight in and out has sort of bolstered his mystique, I guess?
That's a really good point. I would say so. And we see this also with a lot of streamers, big name streamers. They get banned from Twitch, which is a streaming platform, or they get banned from whatever site that they're on. And to the true believers, to their fans who come to them because of the right wing content, they're like, aha, yes, it's true,
Yeah.
that they are being oppressed. The trust and safety, which is a historically female-dominated field in digital online safety, and something also that I actually have experience working in. They'll say like, ah, yes, those people are oppressing my ideology, my beliefs, and also, and I think that this is another part of it, is that when those people get banned from X or Twitch or whatever, well, they don't disappear.
Yeah.
They bring a smaller part of their audience to a smaller platform. They end up on, one of the YouTube clones or one of the Twitch clones. And they end up on like BitChute or something like some of these like really
Yeah.
weird, creepy ones, right?
Or
Um,
Odyssey or something weird, Rumble.
exactly, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And they end up there and they end up bolstering the viewership of those groups, those sites. And like obviously they're not bringing their entire Twitch audience, but they're bringing enough of them that those people are then exposed to even worse stuff, right?
Yes. Yeah. So I imagine, if like Andrew England set up, a Rumble account, then
Hmm.
somebody who follows him over to Rumble would probably end up seeing like Stu Peters or
Yep.
something like that.
Exactly. Exactly. That's exactly
Yeah.
right. And
So
then,
it's like a negative feedback loop of just exposure to these
mhm.
sorts of ideas.
Yeah, it's one of the problems with like it. I mean, it's one of the inherent problems with moderating forums like this, like like a Twitter before it became X, or even something like Blue Sky, which is sort of like intentionally trying to produce a more diversity and progressive focused version of some of like online communications.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, if you kick people out, that just means that they're taking their conversations elsewhere to people who weren't going to be let in the first place.
Yeah.
And that fragmentation carries with it a problem, right? Like again, we're seeing this with the fragmentation of 4chan. 4chan was a terrible website, but it was a very easy place to go if you wanted to see what the right wing was thinking about.
Yeah, that's
Um,
a double-edged sword.
yes, yeah, and now that it's probably gone, I mean, it's still up, it's up again, but like now that the community is probably gone, it's now I find myself being like, well, where do I go if I want to see what the zeitgeist is up to, And it's a harder fight.
Yeah. So let's move on to, the title of the book, which you address in chapter 4. How to talk to your son about fascism. And I know there's, at least some parents in our audience who are watching this. So if a parent, guardian, or whatever, sees their son or their young man sort of heading down this path towards, fascist radicalization, what does that first conversation sort of look like for them?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that here we're lucky in part because we can draw on examples that probably most parents who would end up in a room like this or who would want to pick up the book in the first place, conversations and issues that they've already thought about. So like think about talking to a young man or a young person in general about sexual health and sexual
Hmm.
consent, right? The time to start talking about that is not when they're 16. The time to start talking about that is when they're 10, 11, 12, right? You want to get out ahead of it. And it's the same thing with something like this. You want to get out ahead of it. No, you have to know that they are going to be encountering this messaging. Even if and you want to be the first person to talk to them about it.
Yes.
Like, you can't think like, oh, well, what if I'm just introducing it to them? Like, no, 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 don't worry about it. They're going to find it, or rather, it's going to find them, right? And even if you are watching them like a hawk and don't have Wi-Fi in the house, and they go to a Waldorf school, and like you live on a mountaintop and don't talk to anybody, like they're going to have a friend who shares a meme with them, like 100%. It's going to happen. So you can't keep them from it. You have to get out ahead of it. You have to say like, hey, you're going to be encountering this messaging. You might see a meme that says something like this. You might see a joke that says something like this. You might see a picture. You might hear these words. Let's talk about them first. In the same way that you'll say like, hey, you might hear friends talking about sex. Let's talk about it in a rational way. Or in the same way that if you have a white child and you're a white parent, you might say like, hey, let's talk about white supremacy. Let's talk about racism. Or if you have a male child, you'll say like, hey, let's talk about sexism. Let's talk about feminism together. You have to get out ahead of these conversations. So that's the biggest first step. If if you've maybe waited a little longer, or like the first thing that happens is that they come to you with some of this content, the real thing to do is gauge how they're interacting with it.
Hmm.
If we're talking about like a tween who is sharing something that they thought was funny, or bringing something to you and they're laughing at it, and you can tell like they don't know why this is supposed to be funny, right? It says an anti-Semitic slur, or it says a racist slur, or something like that. Remember yourself when you were younger, like maybe you had an uncomfortable South Park phase or something like that, right? Transgressive humor is appealing to young people. That's not going to stop. We're not going to change that. It's appealing to young people because they're testing boundaries, and because they don't know what's acceptable, and they haven't encountered a lot of the problems that transgressive humor is about, you know? So probably most of the time at first, this is transgressive comedy to them. They think that it's funny, you know? And if that's the case, then like probably all that you really need to think about is just to say like, hey, that's not funny to me. Why is it funny to you? Just like a simple, calm question.
Hmm.
If it's something particularly weird or heinous or something like that, you can say like, oh, my friends don't share that stuff with me. Which one of your friends shared that with you? Or like, where did you find it? Um, oh, you saw it on a group chat. Like, oh, which one? Like, what else do you guys talk about? Just like ask them questions about their media consumption in exactly the same way and in exactly the same tone as you would ask about any of their other media consumptions. I don't exactly know what like super duper young kids are into at the very moment, because my access with this is as an educator of young people in college and high school. But when it comes to these questions, you have to engage with them with curiosity and with
Hmm.
empathy, and understand that like a 10, 11, 12-year old, probably not actually a true believer yet. He just might think it's goofy. Or he might know that it was going to make you mad. And so that's why he brought it up, you know? So you have to start from a position of curiosity and empathy first. Save the big guns for later, um, if they end up being necessary, and, hopefully they aren't.
Yeah. So I know in that same chapter, you discuss, not just talking to, young men about it, but you also talk about, bringing up the subject or broaching the subject with young women, young daughters, and also non-binary people, as, you talk about in that chapter. So how do those conversations differ from a conversation with a young man?
Yeah, going back to the STI sexual health consent conversation, it's similar in that way. Um, if you are talking to a young man about consent, it is primarily going to be a conversation about how to behave in a consensual way. Unfortunately, in our society, if you're talking to a young woman about consent, it's probably going to be about how to be safe, how to know when you are a consenting partner. In that sense, it's a similar situation here. Rather than like trying to inoculate a young man against these kinds of ideas, it instead is going to be, if you're talking to a young woman or a trans kid or a non-binary kid, it's primarily going to be a warning. Like you will with young women and trans and non-binary kids. My advice for parents is you have to assume that they've heard this before. They've probably heard it before. So listen to them first. Ask them if they've heard this stuff. Has somebody said one of these insults? Have they shared one of these memes? Have some of their younger male friends when they were younger, have they like fallen off and gotten weird about sex and gender now that they're in puberty? That's probably happened. You probably aren't going to be telling them about this. So follow their lead on that one. And in that sense, the real thing to do is to get out ahead of it again and to say like, hey, somebody might come at you with insults. They might use some of this language. If they don't know what negging is, tell them.
Hmm.
And say like, hey, this is how these people talk about young women. It's unfair. It's not your fault. It's nobody's fault. It's something creepy and awful that they are doing to you. And make sure that they know that you are a trusted person who they can talk to about this. And most importantly, make sure that they know that you're someone who will believe them when they tell you that something is up, that somebody is, confronting them or attacking them or assaulting them this way. Make sure that they know that you'll believe them and that you won't say boys will be boys or some bullshit like that.
Yeah. So, you bring up, the parent asking the kid or, child guardian, whatever, um, about, you, which one of your friends sort of shared that with you or showed it to you or told you that joke. What does a conversation look like between parents? Not necessarily just between the parent and the child, but between parents who might have, children that are in the same social circle.
That's a really good question. There you have to really evaluate who the parents of your kids' friends are, right?
Hmm.
Because it's very possible that they might have gotten this from home, right?
Yes.
They might have a sexist father or a sexist mother. They might be getting it from their grandparent or an uncle or something. And in that sense, it's going to be a lot harder to build a sort of like anti-fascist community about it. But imagining a situation in which you know that you can talk to them about it, then the thing to do would be to approach them and be like, hey, my kid has been sharing these things and saying them, and he told me that it came from a group chat that your kid is in too. Like no need to make it like a blame about like this particular kid, right? Like
Yeah.
talk about a community, a clique, a
Hmm.
friend group, right? Hey, we're all in this together, right? And the way that we can get them out of this is by not pushing them away, right? If you push them, they're only gonna fall further into these kinds of ideas, right? If you make it so that these ideas seem unacceptable and cool, that's what they'll be. If instead you say like, hey, I don't understand this, I don't want to hear this, where's this coming from? Like this isn't for me and here's why, or like, I don't think that you're hearing all the context here, let's talk about it. If you approach it in that way, like that's what you have to do. And it's going to be hard to get a tween or a teen to sit down and hear that stuff. They might not want to. But the alternative is pushing them away, and that's not going to work either. If instead you're dealing with a fellow parent or a fellow educator or a caregiver or a coach or something, right, who isn't going to be on board with saying like, hey, this stuff is heinous and we can't let our kids talk about it that way, then you're in a much worse position. Then you're going to have to be like, hey, talk to your kid and be like, hey, that kind of stuff, I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to be around it. Here's why. I feel sad for the kids who don't have this kind of help and guidance. I wonder where it's coming from. I wonder what brought them here. Bring your kid into that
Hmm.
kind of conversation. That's a way to go from there.
Yeah. So I think, the last formal question that I want to address here, at least the one that I have, um, so towards the end of the book, you talk about addressing and pushing back against fascism in private realm versus public realm.
Mhm.
So what are some of the main differences that you want the reader and the audience that you're targeting to know about that difference?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That I'm sure that many any academics in the audience and you yourself are familiar with the problem that like when an academic approaches a question, we don't know the answer to the question like fully, and you start writing the book without knowing the answer, hoping that you'll find out. At least that's my writing process. Is I accumulate all the information, I route out all my ideas, I route out all my thoughts, and then somewhere about halfway to two-thirds of the way through, you're like, oh my God, that was the thesis of the book. The difference between fighting fascism in the public realm and the private realm is the thesis of the book.
Hmm.
I realized that I was writing a book about how to fight fascism in private. And the private world and the public world are very different. And this is actually coming back to one of the questions you asked earlier, one of the differences between this book and other ones. Most other books and approaches and discussions about fascism are about fighting fascism in public, how to deal with fascism in government, how to deal with it when it's in the streets of your town, how to deal with it when it's at a small government meeting like a school board or something like that. This book is about how to fight fascism in private, and you have to do it in very different ways. When you're fighting fascism in public, absolutely 100%, no quarter given, don't give them an inch, show up and counter protest, yell and scream, get in the way, block ice. Like that's what we're talking about when we're talking about fighting fascism in public. But when we're talking about fighting fascism in private, yelling at somebody who you invited to your house is not going to help. That is not going to get them out of this. It's not going to make you and your position look good to the people who are neutral or who just sort of like know you both and don't really care. That's just not going to work. Yelling at somebody in a church meeting is not going to work. It's not going to help. Instead, you need to appear to be the reasonable person here, and you need to use a weapon that is only useful in the private sphere. It's not useful in public, but in the private sphere, it's very useful, and that weapon is empathy. Fascists are not prepared for this particular one. They are not producing guides and memes about how to deal with it. When your mom tells you, hey, I don't agree with the thing that you said, but I still love you. And if you're willing to make amends, I'm here, right? That is not something that they have prepared their listeners for. Whereas they have prepared their listeners for shut up and get out, right? They are very prepared for that. So those are the main things, is that empathy is the way to fight fascism in private. If you know somebody, if you care about them, it's broadly the same as like thinking about like, well, what if you had a friend or a colleague or a child or, a nephew or a niece who got into some really serious drug problem,
Yeah.
right? Like if they were in a really serious drug problem, you wouldn't say get out forever. That wouldn't be the first thing that you did, right? The first thing that you did would be to sit down and be like, hey, you have a problem. Let's talk about it. Let's figure out what we can do. Are there treatments you can seek? Are there things going on in your life that this is filling a void? Are you dissatisfied with your life? How can we help? What can we do? And then with subsequent boundary breakings, then you need to build up more and more barriers. And that might be what you need to do. But the first thing to do is to approach it with empathy. And even ultimately, if you say like, hey, if your kid has like gotten into it and he's 25 and like got a swastika tattooed on his body, right? He was really in it. If you say like, hey, you can't be in my community right now, the bravest, most dangerous, difficult thing you can do, and you have to evaluate whether this is safe for you and your community, but the bravest and most dangerous and difficult thing you can do is to say, you can't be in my community now. If you make amends, if you come at me later and you say, I messed up and here's how and here's what I'm doing about it, then maybe you can come back. In exactly the same way that you might for a person who had a serious drug problem who stole money from you, right? Like if that's happened with a friend or a kid, you might say like, you can't be here right now. But if you make amends, maybe we can find a way back. And that's the difficult work. And I'm not asking you to do that to a stranger. I'm only asking you to do it to somebody that you already love and care about.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point and a really great comparison too. I think that's a lot more relatable for a lot more people too. And I
Mhm.
think you just sort of, tore down that barrier that people might have about confusion and trying to approach this in a not necessarily calm, but an empathetic, level-headed sort of way with somebody that they interact with and somebody that they care about.
Yes. And, unfortunately, part of this is me drawing on my own experience. I'm from the Midwest. I know a lot of people who got into opiate issues from high school, right? And like, this is a muscle that unfortunately a lot of Americans have had to flex. But it does mean that it is a skill that is translatable. That particular kind of healthy boundary empathy is the way to move
Yes.
on this.
Yeah, great point. All right. So those are all the formal questions that I
Thank
have
you
for
so
you.
much.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that, I will open the floor to our audience to ask some great questions in our Q&A section. We've got a couple teed up here. So the first one is, this is an excellent conversation. Thank you. Do you see a lot of similarities between fascism and some of the other anti-type movements, i.e., anti-racism movements in the language used or recruitment? The part about teaching oppression seemed to have a lot of overlap.
That's an interesting question. It is true that fascists use a lot of the same rhetoric
Hmm.
that liberation movements use. That is definitely true. I would argue very much against any sort of like policy or political similarity, because the difference is that whereas an anti-racist movement is about uplifting people who are in fact oppressed, fascism is about inventing imagined oppression, or recasting a relative loss of previously outsized power as oppression, right? But the rhetoric is very similar, definitely. And there are actually a lot of interesting similarities, and I'm not a particular expert in this, but there are a lot of interesting similarities and even cooperation sometimes between some of the more right-wing black nationalists and fascists and white nationalist fascists in the United States. So that's definitely an interesting comparison, but black nationalism is not something I'm a particular expert in.
Yeah, there's this famous sort of photo of George Lincoln Rockwell attending, a NOI rally,
Yep.
which was
Oh yeah.
actually at the Uline Arena here in DC.
Oh really? Wow. Okay.
Yes, yeah, yeah. So when, I pass by the Uline Arena, I'm always reminded of that one particular event from 60 some odd years ago, and just it's funny to think about. Not funny, but weird to think about
Well,
that.
even more recently, there have been some interesting interactions between like the Black Israelites and
Hmm.
and some other more explicitly in some other instead white supremacist organizations.
Yes, yeah. Okay, so this one comes from a parent. I have an 11-year-old and a 6-year-old son. The older one really likes online video games, and we've had multiple discussions on people texting him through these platforms. What security measures do you recommend, and are there any subtle indicators you've observed of kids being sucked in?
Yeah, so this is a really important question. Thanks for asking. First, I want to address a question that you haven't asked, which is something that I often get, which is like, how young should we be thinking about this? When I wrote the book, and in the book, I say, 10 to 25, because that's the primary window that the fascists are going after. But a 6-year-old is not too young. I would say that you have to start thinking about this as soon as they are directing their own media consumption. If they are clicking on their own YouTube videos, that means that they could be got, right? Like, and there are videos that are for very young kids. So that's something to be aware of. When it comes to an 11-year-old, yeah, that's exactly prime time for fascist recruitment, and for even like as we said at the top of this, like many of these people are probably not like explicitly fascists, right? They're probably like male supremacists, or they might be spreading anti-Semitic hate, or they might be using the N-word or something like that, right? Warning signs are pretty similar to other warning signs for like other problems that your kid might be facing. Sudden changes in friend group,
Hmm.
like a total transformation in who they hang out with. Really big swings and changes in what they think is funny. If their sense of humor has like swung very hard to like dark or black comedy, which when we're talking about adolescence is probably primarily like insults and saying terrible words and stuff like that. That would be a big warning sign. Another, frankly, one that is just like important to keep an eye on is just like literally how much of their life is on the computer. If you haven't seen it yet, I would highly recommend watching the Netflix drama Adolescence, which is a dramatization of a young man who sort of fell into gender ideology and murders a classmate of his. And I don't believe in spoilers, so if you do, maybe shut your ears for a second. But one of the most prescient things that happens in the series, it's in the last episode. His parents are lamenting what happened, and they say to themselves, "He was just on his computer. We thought he was safe." And like that's really important because the key thing here is that like being on the computer is not safe
No.
when it comes to this. That's where it happens. And so like I would be much less worried about a kid who is like going out and playing sandlot baseball, right? Like that's fine. He might hear some creepy stuff out there, but he's probably not going to encounter a Nazi meme, right? Those are the real indicators, the things to be concerned about, I would say.
Yeah. Um, okay, let me find another one here. How did belief systems among right-wing teens change over the last 5 to 10 years?
Ooh, that's a really good one. Um, I think that the time span that we're talking about here it's about 20 years.
Hmm.
The time span of the popular consumption of the internet. So fascism, like all political movements, uses whatever the newest mode of communication is. I guess this is potentially with the possible exception of Trotskyist movements, which still seem to be very, very, very attached to print newspapers for some reason. Fascists used the internet and used it very well. This has resulted in the mass dissemination of their ideologies in a way that they were incapable of doing before. Partly because TV and radio were heavily regulated, not just in terms of what content they could put on there, but in terms of what content anybody wanted to put on there because of advertisers and company ownership. The belief system among right wing teens has changed because of this. The biggest change that I would say we've seen since, you know, prior to the current version of the extreme right wing in the United States and the Western world, which maybe we could still call the alt right. Prior to that, the biggest version of right wing ideology was, maybe the skinhead movement,
Hmm.
the skinhead revival in the 1990s. This was explicitly neo-Nazi. It was organized around sort of skinhead metal and punk and noise music. It was a lot about like music subcultures and scenes. We're very different now. Now it's about gaming spaces. It's about online communities. It's about online forums. And the biggest change I would say is that whereas the skinhead movement was very explicitly and in your face about white supremacism, this new movement is a lot less so. There are definitely right wing fringes and leaders in it who are very explicitly white supremacists. That is the ultimate end of it. But the vast majority of these people wouldn't come out and like say that they're white supremacists, probably. They would say, as the Proud Boys do, I'm a Western chauvinist, right? They'll talk about Western civilization. They'll talk about democracy. They'll talk about Christianity, right? The other big thing is that the right wing movements merged with pickup artistry, and like male supremacist dating advice perspectives. And that fusion is the real heart of what right-wing movements are today,
Yeah,
especially in the
that
United States.
yeah, that's a really good point. A couple months ago, I did, an event with the author Lois Sherling. She wrote the book Pink Pill, talking
Hmm.
about how women get involved in the far right, and she dedicated a good portion of the book to talking about the quote unquote manosphere with
Yeah.
pickup artists, incels, that whole associated milieu. And I think, her talking about that, you talking about that really just kind of puts a kibosh on that sort of, area of research and study.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so our next question is, um, as research at POE has shown, ideologies like fascism might be growing less coherent among extremists, especially young extremists. Do your prescriptions differ for young people primarily driven by violence rather than ideology? For example, would it differ for a school shooter rather than a neo-Nazi?
That's an extremely good question. I think that the fragmentation of the right wing is one of the big factors that differentiates this particular moment of right wing rise and radicalization from the 20s and 30s, right? And that's partly just because of like how politics has changed. Like there aren't any mass party organizations in the world anymore. Maybe the RSS is an exception, the BJP in India,
Hmm.
but in the rest of the world, there aren't really examples like that. This means that, yeah, it means that like the different ideologies, the different perspectives end up being quite different. And the question asker is absolutely right that there are a lot of movements and groups or like little cadres and like clubs that are about violence as such,
Hmm.
as opposed to violence as a means to an end. And that is a differentiating factor. So, for example, like the group, and I'm forgetting their name. It's a string of numbers. The group that made those threats on the Lady Gaga concert recently in Rio de Janeiro,
Hmm.
or that got that Taylor Swift concert canceled. Where was that, in Mexico? I think Mexico City. Where was that? I think so. Buenos
Sounds
Aires.
right.
Yeah. Those groups are different. They're sort of like about shock and violence as such, as opposed to shock and violence because they believe that it will produce a radical and new better world, right? Which is the fascist perspective. I am I am very loath to recommend talking to law enforcement for most any reason, especially in the United States, given how it works and who it's working for at the moment. But if you are aware of a credible mass violent threat, that is potentially one of the only situations where I would say that that's probably your only option. Those are the big differentiating things. I'm not an expert in groups that are pro-violence as such, but my suspicion is that interest in those groups might have more to do with mental health situations as opposed to ideological perspectives. And so you might want to approach it from that angle. However, that is my armchair opinion. I'm not an expert on that.
Yeah. Let's see. So is there a way to work to implement these conversations in school and in primary education? So for educators, how would an educator approach this?
Yeah, so in the book, I talk with some groups, Canada, the US, the United States, who do some of this stuff, who do programming in schools. And part of what they do is media literacy.
Hmm.
I'm sure that anybody who is a teacher or an educator or a parent in this talk, and that might be 90% of everybody in the talk, you're familiar with the problem that we're facing with young people today, which is that they simply just believe the stuff that they read, right? There's a sort of like issue with whether or not they can evaluate the veracity of things that they read and see. Helping them to do that is a big important piece of this. So helping young kids to be like, you see something online, think to yourself, who made this? Why did they make it? Why am I seeing it? You know, what do they want me to do? Think about it in the same way that you think about an advertisement. what goal of theirs does this serve? That's one way that it can enter the education system. Another way is if you are in a, this is possibly more valid if you're involved in a private school
Hmm.
where these kinds of policies might be more accessible to you, or in a public school where your school board is relatively progressive and on board with these kinds of things. There are people who come and talk to schools. There are people who give trainings. This is something that I've done for educators and for parents and other folks. But yeah, it has to be a part of the curriculum. In the same way, I mean, I would argue that it belongs in the curriculum in the same way that sex ed belongs in the curriculum.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that can be a third rail as well. So
It very much
you see,
is.
yeah, you see where we find ourselves. Um, so one question asked is, we speak of young men, 10 to 25 years old. What is your observation on young military personnel being recruited?
That's a very good question. That's not something I'm a particular expert in, but it is definitely true that surveys of young military personnel in the United States, especially, have shown increased right wing ideology in them compared to previous decades. Whether or not that is because of increased right wing ideology amongst young men in general, or if it's because of military participation, is hard to say. The bad news is that most of the time, when fascists try to take power, whether or not the military supports them is the big question. And if the army is not on your side, then probably they're going to stick with the status quo, right? If they try to stage a putsch, right? But if you do have the military on your side, then you have a lot more going for you if you're actually trying to take over state power. And given how that is moving in the United States, that we're in a much more dangerous situation than we certainly would be if, for example, the military were controlled by career soldiers like Miller, for example, who
Hmm.
previously was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, right? Trump's removal of generals who were not sufficiently obsequious and loyal to him is a big dangerous sign. Although I'm sure I don't need to tell anybody that.
Yeah. So sort of my opinion on that is it sort of has to center around military culture as a whole. I'm a veteran myself, so I experienced a lot of this. You
Hmm.
know, the military is a very hypermasculine, male-focused, you know, microcosm of society.
Hmm.
Um, and the military has been growing increasingly diverse across all branches,
Hmm.
and in all sorts of, subsets within branches, all your different jobs, your MOSs and everything like that. And, the opening up of combat roles to women in the military, I think around like 2015 time frame was a whole, you know, debate in and of itself.
Hmm.
Um, so I can see some parallels between, you know, cultural culture war touch points like that, and Craig, what you're talking about in a loss of perceived or a perceived loss of, rightful status within
Yes.
different organizations or within different parts of society. So, if men are seeing that there are less slots for them in combat roles because supposedly a woman or anybody who else who isn't a white male is ending up in that
Hmm.
position,
Hmm.
then there is a threat that is portrayed to them because they are the rightful occupants of this sort of social position. And in this case, a position of actual authority in, once you get to that rank.
Yeah.
Um, so that's the way that I see it, and that's a very short answer to a very long and complicated
Yes. It's a very
answer with
interesting
that.
question. Thank you.
Yes. Um, so we have time for one or two more questions. What are some of the most common misconceptions parents have about how young men get drawn into far-right ideologies?
I would say that the biggest misconception that people have is that the biggest misconception that people have is why young people are doing these things. I think a lot of parents are willing to jump the gun and to be like, "Oh, well, if my kid is saying this, then that must mean that they're a true believer and they're a neo-Nazi already, right?" when in reality they're probably just pushing buttons. They're seeing what will make you mad. They're seeing what they can get away with. You know, they're a teenager, right? Um, the other misconception, though, is the parallel one, or I guess the mirror one, which is that like, don't worry, this is just online, right? Like, we don't need to worry about it because this is just online stuff, or it's just a goof, or it's just a meme, or it's just a video game. Like, imagine for older folks in the audience, you know, like imagine if imagine if you came to your father when you were 10 and you were like, hey, somebody said a racial slur to me on the telephone. Imagine if he said, oh, that's just the telephone. Like, that's not the real world. That's just the telephone. That doesn't make any sense at all, right? Online world is the real world. And that's something that a lot of parents need to really wrap their minds around. And like almost everybody's life is like very, very much online right now. But even the parts of the online world that you aren't in, those are equally real to the ones that you are. So like maybe young people aren't really on Facebook anymore, but where are they? They're on Discord servers, they're on group chats, they're on like, you know, video game chat rooms and like video game chat inside the game. That is real. And that's a big misconception that a lot of people have.
All right. So we will have one more question and then we will call it there.
Mhm.
So it seems way easier to approach kids or more naive people in a preventive fashion. How about approaching grown adults where the conversations will naturally be much more exhausting and very contrarian?
Yeah, I did an Ask Me Anything on Reddit a couple months ago about the book, and the biggest question that I got was this one: was how do I talk to my dad about fascism?
Mm,
I mean, the question asker is right. It'll be a lot harder. When it comes to talking to an adult, yeah, you can't do this inoculation, prevention is a pound of cure thing. You're not going to get out ahead of it. And they're not going to be poised to listen to you as somebody that they know knows more about the world than they do. Instead, empathy is going to be your only weapon here. And you have to say, like, hey, that's not what I want to hear when I come to your house for Thanksgiving, or when you come to my house to hang out. That's not what I want to see in the group chat. That's not what I want to do. That's not how I want to engage with it. And you have to make an evaluation, a similar evaluation, but a harsher one, because you're dealing with an adult who is responsible for their own behavior and who should know better, right? In a way that a 12-year-old, we might say that a 12-year-old should know better, but like, you know, it's our job to teach them better, right?
yeah.
You have to make a harsher, a harder evaluation about keeping that person in your life or not. Like I said, I'm from the Midwest. I'm no stranger to relatives who believe some pretty heinous stuff, and I've had to make these evaluations myself and think about how I want to engage with it. However, again, if you're talking about it in the private world, the real weapons that really work a lot better than yelling and screaming are be the reasonable person in the room, be the calm person in the room. I don't know about you, but I've never gotten anybody to listen to me by yelling. Usually, if I have to yell, that means that they don't think I deserve their attention. So approach it calmly, directly, establish boundaries, and enforce them. These are, you know, in a lot of ways, it looks like good mental health practices in general.
So almost a gentle parenting approach for older folks.
That's right. Yep.
Excellent. All right. And with that, we will close out the Q&A portion of our event. So first, I'd like to thank Craig for joining us today. Very thankful for you taking time out of your day to join us and talk
Oh,
about your book.
I had a wonderful time. Thanks so much, Luke, and thanks everybody again at the center, and thanks for all the question askers.
Of course. So of course, you know, writing books is not the only thing that you do. You also host a podcast. Where
Mhm.
can people find your podcast?
Yeah, so the podcast is called 15 Minutes of Fascism, and it's on SoundCloud, but it's also on Apple, it's on Spotify, it's on most of the podcaster apps. I also recently started a YouTube channel, which is on YouTube at 15 Minutes of Fascism as well. Yeah,
Excellent. All right, everybody. So you heard the man. Go listen to his podcast. Go subscribe to his YouTube channel. Give him that nice silver plaque. All right. So
I'll
with
display it
that,
right there. Yeah.
yeah, excellent. All right. So with that, we will conclude today's event. Thank you to all our guests for showing up today and asking all these great questions. We will see you next time.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Luke.